Marcia Williams had always been known as the quiet woman who lived at the end of Pine Street. Her small house had peeling paint, a squeaky front door, and a tiny garden filled with wildflowers she had planted herself. She didn't have much money, but she had something far more valuable, a big heart. Everyone in the neighborhood knew her as someone who would give away her last loaf of bread if someone else was hungry. She often helped elderly neighbors carry their groceries, babysat kids for free, and shared warm meals with anyone who knocked on her door. One winter evening, the wind howled through the streets, and the sky was dark long before dinner time. Marcia was walking home from her part-time job at the diner. Her shoes were old and thin, and her hands were tucked deep into her coat pockets to keep warm. As she passed by the old grocery store, she heard a faint sound, like someone quietly crying. She stopped and listened carefully. The sound came from behind the building. Curious and worried, Marcia walked around the corner. There, crouched together behind a pile of empty crates, were 4 children. Their clothes were torn, and their faces were pale and dirty. The oldest looked no more than 12, while the youngest couldn't have been older than 3. They were huddled close, trying to share body warmth, and their small bodies were shivering in the freezing air. Marcia's heart broke at the sight. She slowly approached, speaking gently so they wouldn't be afraid. "Hey there, sweethearts. Are you all right? Where are your parents?" she asked softly. The children didn't answer at first. The oldest boy stood in front of the others, trying to protect them. His eyes were filled with fear and suspicion. Finally, in a trembling voice, he said, We don't have anywhere to go." Marcia knelt down so she could meet their eyes. "Are you hungry?" she asked. They nodded silently. Without another word, she took off her scarf and wrapped it around the youngest child. She opened her old purse, pulled out the small sandwich she had saved for dinner, and handed it to them. They tore it into pieces and shared it quickly, as if they hadn't eaten in days. Marcia knew she couldn't just leave them there. The temperature was dropping fast, and they would not survive the night on the streets. She looked at their tired faces and saw not just hunger, but hopelessness, the kind that no child should ever feel. Something inside her stirred, stronger than fear, stronger than doubt. She made her decision right there. "Come with me," she said kindly. "I don't have much, but I have a warm house and soup on the stove." The children hesitated. Life had taught them not to trust easily. But the way Marcia spoke, the softness in her eyes, and the warmth in her voice gave them a tiny spark of hope. Slowly, they stood up and followed her. The walk to her home was quiet. Snow began to fall in small, soft flakes, landing on their hair and eyelashes. Marcia walked close to them, keeping an eye on the little one who stumbled from exhaustion. When they finally reached her small house, she pushed open the squeaky door and led them inside. The children stood silently in her living room, looking around as if they had entered another world. It wasn't fancy. The furniture was old, and the carpet had faded spots, but it felt safe. It smelled of fresh bread and lavender, and the heater hummed softly. Marcia brought out thick blankets from her closet, wrapping each child warmly. Then she poured them hot soup into mismatched bowls. As they ate, she gently asked their names. The oldest boy was named Darius. Then came twins called Maya and Malik. And the youngest was little Rose. They had been living on the streets since their mother disappeared months ago, and they hadn't seen their father in years. They had survived by sleeping in abandoned buildings and eating whatever scraps they could find. Marcia listened with tears in her eyes. She didn't know how long she could afford to care for them, but she knew she could not let them return to the cold. That night, she set up makeshift beds in the living room, layering them with blankets. One by one, the children drifted off to sleep, their bellies full and their bodies warm for the first time in months. As she watched them sleep, Marcia felt something change inside her. She had lived alone for many years, and though she had friends, her house was always silent. But tonight, it was filled with soft breathing, with life, with something that felt like family. She whispered a quiet promise to herself. She would protect them, no matter what it cost. Outside, the snow kept falling. The world was cold and harsh, but inside that small house on Pine Street, there was warmth, safety, and the first spark of love that would one day grow into something powerful. Marcia didn't know it yet, but that night would mark the beginning of a story that would change all of their lives forever. Asterisk. The morning sunlight slipped gently through the thin curtains, landing on the 4 sleeping children curled up on the living room floor. Marcia stood quietly at the doorway, holding a warm cup of tea in her hands, and watched them breathe softly. For the first time in years, her small house didn't feel lonely. It felt alive. It felt like something precious had entered her life, something she didn't even know she was missing. When the children woke up, they were shy and quiet. They didn't know how to act in someone else's home. Darius, the oldest, tried to stay serious, as if protecting the others was his only job. The twins, Maya and Malik, sat close together, their hands always touching like they were afraid of being separated. Little Rose, still half asleep, just clung to the edge of Marcia's worn sweater as if it were the safest thing in the world. Marcia made pancakes for breakfast. Even though she had to use up the last of her eggs and milk, she didn't care. She smiled as she flipped each one on the pan, watching the children's eyes light up as the sweet smell filled the room. When she placed the plates on the table, they hesitated for a moment, as if they weren't sure this was really for them. But when she nodded and said, "Eat, my loves," they ate hungrily, giggling between bites. It was the first time in months they laughed without fear. As days passed, Marcia began adjusting her life around the children. She found herself packing extra lunches, washing tiny socks, and teaching them small chores like folding laundry and watering her flowers. She had to stretch every dollar she earned, but she did it gladly. She picked up extra shifts at the diner and even sold homemade jam at the weekend market to buy school clothes and notebooks. For them, it wasn't easy. Sometimes, bills piled up and her body ached from working double shifts. But each time she returned home, the sight of their smiling faces erased her tiredness. Darius would run to take her bag. Maya would hand her a drawing she made. Malik would tell her about something funny at school. And little Rose would simply wrap her arms around Marcia's legs, saying, "Mama, you came back." That word "Ma" melted her heart every time. At first, the children had nightmares. They would wake up crying, trembling with fear of being abandoned again. Marcia would sit beside them in the dark, gently rubbing their backs, whispering, "You're safe now. I'm here. I won't leave." Sometimes they cried themselves to sleep on her lap. And she let them, staying awake just to make sure they didn't wake up alone. Slowly, their fears began to fade. The house that was once silent became filled with laughter, little arguments over toys, and the sound of footsteps running across the wooden floor. Marcia made sure they went to school every day. Darius, who had once been so guarded, started opening up to his teachers and showed a natural talent for writing. Maya loved painting and filled the house with colorful drawings. Malik was full of energy, always fixing broken things with tape and imagination. And Rose grew more confident each day, her bright smile becoming the sun of their small family. The neighbors noticed the change too. They would see Marcia walking with the kids hand in hand, carrying school bags, and they would smile. People who once saw her as the quiet woman at the end of the street now saw her as something much greater, a mother. And in her heart, that's exactly what she had become. She didn't just give them food and shelter. She gave them belonging, love, and the courage to dream. They were no longer for homeless kids. They were her children. One evening, as they sat together eating spaghetti at their tiny kitchen table, Darius suddenly looked up and said softly, "If it wasn't for you, we wouldn't be here." Marcia's eyes filled with tears. She reached across the table and took his hand, then looked at all four of them. "You saved me too," she said with a smile. And she meant it in the quiet of that moment, surrounded by the children she had once found shivering in the cold. Marcia realized something powerful: love had turned strangers into family. And in building their new lives, they had unknowingly built a home inside her heart. Life slowly began to feel like a dream for Marcia and the children. Each morning started with the sound of laughter and footsteps rushing through the small house. The walls, once silent, now echoed with giggles, homework chatter, and bedtime stories. Marcia had never imagined her life would be this full. She watched the children grow stronger, smarter, and happier each day, and it gave her a reason to keep going. No matter how hard things became, but sometimes, life can be cruel even to those who carry the kindest hearts. It all started on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. Marcia had finished her shift at the diner and stopped by the local grocery store to pick up some pasta and bread. The children were at school, and she was looking forward to cooking their favorite meal. As she walked out of the store, she noticed flashing red and blue lights at the end of the street. At first, she thought it was just another traffic stop, something that happened often in their neighborhood. She had no idea that those flashing lights were the beginning of the nightmare that would tear her world apart. That evening, as the kids sat at the table drawing pictures, there was a loud knock at the door. When Marcia opened it, 2 police officers stood there. Their faces were serious. "Are you Marcia Williams?" one of them asked. Confused but calm, she nodded. Before she could even ask why they were there, they stepped inside and read her rights. Marcia felt the room spin around her. "There must be some mistake," she whispered, her voice trembling. The children screamed and clung to her legs as the officers placed cold handcuffs around her wrists. Little Rose cried so hard she could barely breathe. Darius shouted she didn't do anything. "She's our mom." But the officers didn't listen. They carried her away while the children stood frozen, their eyes wide with fear and disbelief at the police station. Marcia learned that she was being accused of a serious crime: armed robbery and assault at a nearby convenience store. The words didn't make sense. She had never even held a weapon in her life. She had been at work during the time they said the crime happened. She told them about her shift at the diner. But the officers claimed they had a witness who said they saw someone who looked like her at the scene. They said her name had come up in a tip from an anonymous caller. It was a cruel mistake, but the system didn't seem to care about the truth. Days turned into weeks. Marcia sat behind cold jail bars while the children were taken away by child services. She cried herself to sleep every night thinking about them. She worried if they were safe, if they were scared, if they thought she had abandoned them. The trial came quickly, and it was like walking into a storm. Marcia had a public defender who barely met with her and seemed distracted during the hearings. The prosecutor painted her as a desperate woman who committed a crime to support her children. No one wanted to listen to her side of the story. The diner where she worked failed to find the old shift sheet proving she was there. The security footage from the robbery was blurry, but the figure in it had her same height and hairstyle. And that was enough for the jury to raise doubts. Marcia kept saying, "I didn't do this. Please, I have children who need me." But her voice seemed too small inside that big courtroom. Finally, the verdict came. Guilty. The word echoed in her ears like thunder. The judge's voice was cold as he sentenced her to life imprisonment without parole. Life? The room spun as she stood in shock, her heart breaking into pieces. She thought of the children, her children, and how they would feel when they learned she would not be coming home, when they led her away in chains. She saw the children sitting quietly in the back row of the courtroom. Their faces were pale and wet with tears. Darius held Rose tightly while the twins leaned against each other, shaking. Marcia tried to smile at them, tried to be strong, but her lips trembled. "I love you," she mouthed silently, just before the guards took her away. That night, her cell was cold and silent, the opposite of the warm, noisy home she once had. She curled up on the thin mattress and stared at the ceiling. Every memory of the children ran through her mind: the first pancakes, the bedtime hugs, the way they called her mama. Now, they were gone, and she was trapped behind bars for something she had not done. The world outside moved on without her, but for Marcia, time froze in that moment. She had saved 4 children from the streets, given them love, given them a future, and now she was alone, locked away, branded a criminal. She did not know it yet, but far away. Those same children she had saved were already whispering promises to each other. They were too young to understand how the world worked. But they understood this. They would never forget her, and someday, somehow, they would bring her home, the day Marcia was taken away. The world the children knew crumbled like broken glass. One moment, they had a mother, a home, and warmth. The next, they were standing alone in a cold courthouse hallway, holding plastic bags with a few of their clothes inside. Social workers guided them away gently, but their voices were distant, like echoes underwater. Nothing made sense. They were split up that very night. Darius and Malik were sent to one foster home, while Maya and little Rose were sent to another. The siblings cried when they were separated. They had promised each other they would always stay together. But now they were riding away in different cars, watching each other through blurred windows until they disappeared into the dark. Life in foster care was nothing like the life they had with Marcia. The houses were clean and full of things, but they didn't feel like home. They had rules, schedules, and strangers who told them when to eat, when to sleep, when to speak. Some of the foster parents were kind but distant, treating them like temporary guests. Others were strict, never smiling or asking how they felt. At night, the children cried quietly into their pillows. They missed Marcia's soft voice, her bedtime stories, the smell of her pancakes on Sunday mornings. They missed how she would sing silly songs while folding laundry, or how she always kissed their foreheads before school. Everything felt cold without her. Even when the rooms were warm, the air around them seemed empty. Darius, as the oldest, tried to stay strong. He told the others in letters, "We have to keep going." She would want us to be brave. But when he was alone, he hid his tears. He blamed himself for not protecting her, for not proving her innocence. He carried the weight of that guilt every day, even as he tried to focus in school. Maya stopped painting for months. She kept her sketchbook closed, afraid that if she opened it, memories of their life with Marcia would come rushing back and break her heart all over again. Malik grew quiet, no longer the playful boy who fixed broken toys. He spent hours staring out of windows, imagining Marcia walking up the driveway to take them home, and Rose, still so small, barely understood what had happened. She only knew that Mama Marcia was gone. Some nights, she stood by the door in her pajamas, waiting for her to come through it. When she didn't, Rose would curl up with Marcia's old scarf that she had kept hidden under her pillow. It still smelled faintly like her. Despite the pain, time moved forward. Months turned into years. The children moved between different foster homes, different schools, different cities. They grew taller, older, stronger, but inside, each of them carried a piece of the same wound. No matter where they lived, no place ever truly felt like theirs. They always felt like borrowed souls living borrowed lives, because the person who made them feel real was gone. But even as the world tried to pull them apart, they held on to each other. They wrote letters secretly, passed notes through social workers, and promised to reunite one day. Every birthday, they made silent wishes for Marcia. Every Christmas, they imagined her at a table full of food, smiling and free. As teenagers, they became determined to survive, not just for themselves, but for her. Darius threw himself into his studies, becoming one of the top students in his class. He dreamed of becoming a lawyer, even though he never told anyone why. Maya slowly began drawing again. Her art was full of warmth, flowers, and glowing windows images of home. Malik joined a community workshop where he learned how to build and repair things, hoping one day to build a home for all of them. Rose grew into a bright, kind-hearted girl who loved reading stories about brave people who never gave up. She secretly believed Marcia was still being brave somewhere, waiting for them. Every once in a while, Darius tried to contact Marcia. He sent letters to the prison, writing how much they loved her, how they were staying strong. Most of the letters came back unopened. Sometimes he cried over the envelopes, wondering if she even knew they hadn't forgotten her. They didn't know it, but Marcia still thought about them every single day too. She imagined their faces every morning and whispered their names every night before she closed her eyes in her cold cell. By the time the children reached their late teens, they had been through more pain than most people face in a lifetime. But instead of letting it destroy them, they turned it into determination. They decided that they would make something of their lives, not only to escape their broken past, but to honor the woman who gave them love when they had nothing. They didn't speak it out loud at first, but each of them carried the same secret fire. One day, they would find a way to bring Marcia back home. They didn't know how. They didn't know when, but they believed in her innocence with their whole hearts. And though the world thought they had moved on, deep down they were still the same children who had once been rescued on a cold winter. Night children who would never stop trying to rescue her in return. Years passed like silent whispers through the wind. And the children who had once clung to each other in fear slowly grew into young adults with determined hearts. Though time had changed their faces, stretched their bodies taller, and carried them into different corners of the world, the memory of Marcia stayed, carved deep inside them like a heartbeat that never stopped. They had learned how to survive without her, but never how to stop missing her. Darius was the first to break through the invisible cage of their past. He had always been the protector, the one who held everyone together when the world tried to tear them apart. In high school, he studied as if every page he read could build a bridge back to Marcia. He read law books late at night under a dim lamp, his eyes tired but burning with quiet fire. He pushed himself through college on scholarships, part-time jobs, and sleepless nights until he finally stood in a courtroom not as a broken boy, but as a young lawyer in a sharp suit. Behind his confident smile, he carried a secret vow. One day, I will use these laws to bring her back. Maya followed her own path through art. After years of silence, she began painting again, pouring her emotions onto every canvas. Her work was filled with warm lights glowing from tiny windows, hands reaching for each other, and faces that resembled Marcia's kind eyes. People saw beauty in her art, but Maya knew it was more than that. It was her way of keeping Marcia alive. Her talent earned her a scholarship to an art school, where she became known for pieces that made people cry without knowing why. She was quietly rebuilding hope with every brushstroke. Malik became an inventor of sorts. In foster care, he had fixed broken radios, bent wires back into place, and turned old trash into small machines that buzzed and blinked. That curiosity grew into a love for engineering. He studied hard, took internships, and eventually started working in community development, designing low-cost housing for families like the one they once were. Every time he saw a struggling child move into a safe home, he thought, "This is what she would want me to do." And little Rose, the baby of the family, grew into a gentle but fearless young woman. She became a social worker, dedicating her life to helping children who had no one because she knew what it felt like to be one of them. She carried Marcia's old scarf folded neatly in her bag everywhere she went, as if it were a piece of the love that had saved her. Whenever a frightened child clung to her hand, Rose would smile softly and think, "You deserve someone like Marcia, too." Though their lives had become busy and full of achievements, the four of them stayed in close contact. They called each other every week, shared every success, and reminded one another of their shared promise. No matter how many years passed, they never let the world make them forget their real mission. One night, when the four of them finally gathered together again in Darius's tiny apartment, the air felt different. They hadn't all been in the same room in years. There was laughter, hugs, and tears. But also something heavier lingering in their eyes, something that had been waiting too long as the night grew quiet. Darius finally spoke the words they had all been carrying. "It's been 20 years. She's still in there. And she's innocent. We can't wait anymore." The room fell silent. Rose's eyes filled with tears. Maya set down her tea, her hands trembling. Malik nodded slowly. They didn't need to argue. They didn't need to ask if it was possible. Deep inside, they had already decided long ago. They were going to free Marcia. They knew it wouldn't be easy. The case was old, buried under dust and forgotten files. The legal system had already stamped her name with the word guilty and walked away. But they weren't afraid of how hard it would be. They had walked through darkness before. They had survived broken homes, empty stomachs, and years of loneliness. And now they were stronger. Darius began pulling out documents, old newspaper articles, and faded court transcripts he had collected quietly over the years. He spread them across the table like pieces of a puzzle. Maya promised to use her growing fame as an artist to bring public attention to Marcia's story. Malik said he would build an online platform to raise funds and gather support from people who believed in justice. Rose offered to reach out to organizations that fought wrongful convictions. They sat together until dawn, drawing plans, whispering strategies, dreaming of the day they would see her walk out of prison gates free. For the first time in 20 years, they didn't just miss her. They were moving toward her, and though Marcia didn't know it yet, the children she once saved from the cold were rising from the ashes of their pain, ready to become her rescuers. The plan began like a small flicker of light in a room that had been dark for too long. After that night in Darius's apartment, the four of them returned to their separate lives. But something inside each of them had shifted. They were no longer just surviving. They were on a mission, and this time they weren't powerless children. They were grown, strong, and determined to rewrite the ending of Marcia's story. Darius led the way. He had the mind of a lawyer, now sharp, careful, and relentless. Late at night, when the rest of the world was asleep, he pored over Marcia's old case files. The papers were faded and fragile from age, but he read every line, every witness statement, every piece of supposed evidence. The more he read, the angrier he became. There were holes everywhere, timelines that didn't match, missing documents, and sloppy police work. The so-called eyewitness who claimed to have seen Marcia had given a vague description that could have matched dozens of people. And the diner where she worked hadn't been asked for proper time cards, even though she had always been on shift during the crime. Darius began writing letters to anyone who might listen. Innocence projects, civil rights groups, investigative journalists, even retired judges. Most letters went unanswered. Some replied politely, but said the case was too old, too complicated, or lacked new evidence. Each rejection felt like a punch to the heart, but Darius refused to stop. He had carried her memory for 2 decades. He wasn't going to let bureaucracy bury her. Truth, while Darius battled in the legal world, Maya fought in the world of hearts. She used her art like a weapon made of beauty and pain. She created a powerful series of paintings called Mama Behind Bars, showing a warm-eyed woman in a prison cell while children's handprints reached through the bars toward her. The series went viral on social media. People from all over the country shared the images, asking who the woman was. That's when Maya told them, she is Marsha Williams. She saved us, and now she needs saving. Soon, journalists began calling. Maya gave interviews, her voice trembling with emotion as she described the night Marsha found them freezing behind the store. The laughter she filled their lives with, and the heartbreak of watching her be taken away in chains. Her words touched millions. Strangers began posting with the hashtag #FreeMarsha. For the first time in 20 years, the world was starting to look at Marsha's name not as a criminal, but as a human being. Malik worked behind the scenes, building the foundation that held their fight together. He created a website that told Marsha's story, displayed the holes in her case, and gave people ways to donate or volunteer. He turned his quiet tech skills into a voice loud enough to be heard. He coded late at night with music in his headphones, his fingers flying over the keyboard, fueled by memories of her smile. Within months, their campaign had gathered thousands of supporters and enough donations to hire a skilled private investigator. Rose became the heart of their movement. As a social worker, she had connections to advocacy groups that fought wrongful convictions. She spoke at events, standing small but strong on big stages, telling the story of a woman who had saved her life with nothing but love. She met with lawyers, handed out folders of evidence, and walked through government halls that once scared her as a child. She believed in us when no one else did, she told them. Now it's our turn to believe in her. Her sincerity disarmed people. She wasn't dramatic or loud. She was gentle, honest, and impossible to ignore. Little by little, things began to change. A legal nonprofit finally agreed to review the case. They found shocking details. DNA from the crime scene had never been tested because the technology hadn't existed back then. Old security footage from the diner surfaced, showing Marsha walking in the background during the time the crime was committed. The so-called eyewitness had since passed away, but old notes from the original detective showed they had been unsure about their identification from the start. Asterisk. The puzzle pieces were finally shifting, showing a new picture, one where Marsha was innocent. But the fight wasn't easy. The state refused to admit wrongdoing. Court hearings were delayed. Some people accused the siblings of making up stories for attention. Every time they hit a wall, it hurts, but they remembered how Marsha had never given up on them, and that gave them strength. They supported each other like they always had. When Darius came home from long legal meetings exhausted, Maya cooked for him. When Maya felt overwhelmed by interviews, Molly cracked jokes to make her laugh. When Malik got discouraged by hateful comments online, Rose reminded him, "We're not doing this to be liked. We're doing this to bring her home." For the first time since they were children, they were all living for the same dream again. Not just as individuals, but as a family. And somewhere in a gray prison cell, Marsha sat quietly on her bunk, her hair now streaked with silver, her hands resting in her lap. She didn't know what was happening outside. She only knew that her heart sometimes fluttered at night, as if whispering to her, "They haven't forgotten you. They're coming." She didn't know it yet, but the 4 children she once saved were breaking through the walls of the world, piece by piece, day by day, to bring her back to the life and love she had given them. Asterisk. The air inside the courtroom felt heavier than stone. After 20 years, everything had led to this day. The 4 of them sat side by side on the wooden bench, their knees almost touching, their hearts racing as if they were children again. It had taken years of letters, petitions, interviews, and legal battles. There were nights they had cried from exhaustion, days when the system seemed too powerful to fight. But now, they were here so close to giving Marsha the life she had deserved all along at the front. Darius sat at the attorney's table, wearing a crisp black suit and a calm expression that barely hid the storm inside him. He had become the legal voice Marsha never had. His opening words were strong but steady. He spoke about the night she saved for homeless children. He spoke about how she worked 2 jobs, never missed a shift, and had no reason or chance to commit the crime. Then he revealed the evidence, the untouched DNA that proved someone else had been at the crime scene. The old diner footage showing Marcia working during the time of the robbery. The retired detective's notes admitting the eyewitness was unsure. Piece by piece, he tore apart the case that had stolen her life. The courtroom stayed silent, except for his voice. Even the judge leaned forward. Behind Darius, Maya sat gripping a folded tissue in her hand. She could still see Marcia's smile from that first night, her voice singing them to sleep in a tiny living room. Now Maya's eyes overflowed with tears, but she kept them silent. She had painted her pain into the world. Today, she wanted only to see justice. Malik sat next to her, his usually calm face trembling. He had coded websites, run campaigns, sent thousands of emails. But nothing had prepared him for this moment. When hope felt like it was standing right outside the door, knocking softly, waiting to be let in. Rose's hands were pressed together in her lap, like she was holding a prayer. She remembered the way Marcia used to braid her hair in the mornings before school. She had been so small back then, sitting on the floor, while Marcia gently untangled each strand. Rose could almost feel those warm hands again as she whispered to herself, "Please, let her come home." And then the doors opened. 2 guards escorted Marcia inside. She was thinner. Her hair streaked with silver now, but her eyes, those warm, soft eyes, were still the same. When she saw them, she froze. Her lips parted like she couldn't breathe. And then, very slowly, she smiled. A trembling, astonished smile. Like a woman waking from a 20-year dream and finding that the children she once saved were standing there as grown souls, fighting for her. The hearing lasted hours. Darius spoke. The prosecutors tried to resist, and the judge asked question after question. The tension built like a storm, ready to break. And then, after reviewing all the evidence, the judge looked at Marcia. His voice was calm but firm. "This court finds that Marcia Williams was wrongfully convicted. The case is overturned. Ms. Williams, you are free to go." The world stopped for a heartbeat. Then, everything burst open. Maya sobbed into her hands. Malik let out a laugh that cracked into a cry. Rose covered her mouth in shock, tears falling down her cheeks like rain. And Darius strong. Composed, Darius lowered his head and cried for the first time in years. Marcia stood in silence, shaking as the guard unlocked her cuffs. The cold metal fell away from her wrists with a soft clink. She took one slow step forward. And then the children she had saved rushed toward her all at once, surrounding her in a circle of arms, tears, laughter, and 20 years of love that had never died. She held them like she was afraid they might disappear. They held her like they were never letting go again. In that moment, the world felt new. The courtroom, once heavy with sorrow, now glowed with something unbreakable, hope outside. When they finally walked through the courthouse doors, sunlight poured over them like a blessing. People clapped and cheered. Strangers held signs that said, "Welcome home, Marcia," and "Justice at last." Reporters shouted questions. But Marcia only had eyes for the 4 faces in front of her. She whispered through tears, "You kept your promise." And Darius answered softly, "We kept our family." For the first time in 20 years, she was free, not just from prison bars, but from the silence, the loneliness, and the years stolen from her. And for the first time, they were whole again. The first night Marcia spent outside prison walls was quiet. Almost too quiet. She sat on the balcony of Darius's apartment, wrapped in a soft blanket that Rose had brought her, while the city lights sparkled like scattered stars below. The night air carried the scent of rain and warm concrete, and every sound, passing cars, distant laughter, a barking dog, felt like a tiny miracle. For 20 years, her world had been cold steel. Locked doors and the same dull gray walls. Now, the world seemed impossibly wide. She could breathe without permission. She could turn her face to the wind and feel it brush her skin. She could see the moon without bars cutting through it. Inside, the four of them bustled around like happy children. Maya was cooking a huge dinner. Malik was setting the table with mismatched plates. And Rose kept bringing Marcia warm cups of tea, as if afraid she might vanish if they stopped holding her close. They laughed over small things. Stories from their childhoods she had missed. Maya told her how she became an artist and showed her the painting that had gone viral, Mama Behind Bars. Marcia stared at it for a long time, tears silently slipping down her cheeks. She said it was the most beautiful thing anyone had ever made for her. Later that night, they all sat cross-legged on the living room floor, the same way they used to when they were children, and she would tell them bedtime stories. But this time, they were the ones telling her stories of their lives, their struggles, their victories, and how her love had carried them through everything. "You gave us life," Rose whispered. "So we gave it back to you." From that night forward, everything began to change. Darius filed paperwork to have her name fully cleared, not just released. He wanted the world to know she was innocent, not just free. Malik used his tech skills to start a website called Marcia's Light, a space for sharing stories of other people wrongfully imprisoned. Donations flooded in. Journalists wrote about her everywhere, calling her the woman who raised a family from a prison cell. And Marcia? She learned to live again. At first, it was small things. She learned to use a smartphone, amazed that one small screen could hold the entire world. She wandered through grocery stores like they were museums, marveling at all the colors and choices. She stood barefoot in the grass of a park for the first time in decades, closing her eyes as if she were listening to the earth itself. Then came bigger steps. She moved into a small house that the four of them helped decorate. Maya painted the walls in warm colors. Malik set up her Wi-Fi. Darius handled the paperwork. And Rose filled the kitchen with the smell of cinnamon and coffee. It wasn't just a house. It was a promise. You are home now. Soon, people began asking Marcia to speak at events about her story. At first, she was nervous. But then she realized something powerful: her voice could help others who were still trapped in cages they didn't belong in. She started visiting prisons, sitting across from frightened women and telling them, "Don't let this place steal your soul. Someone out there still loves you. Hold on." Everywhere she went, she carried the faces of the four children she had once saved, now standing proudly beside her. They weren't just her family anymore. They were her legacy. On the 1-year anniversary of her freedom, they gathered again in that same living room. There was music, laughter, candles, and cake. At midnight, Marcia stood up, her eyes shining, and raised her glass. "To love," she said softly, "the kind that never gives up and always finds its way home." They clinked glasses and held each other close. In that moment, the pain of the past no longer defined them. They were not broken people stitched together by tragedy anymore. They were a family whole, unshakable, and filled with light. For the first time in 20 years, Marcia was not just free. She was alive, and her story, their story, was just beginning.